So pretty much the remainder of the semester was going to be divided roughly into thirds. And the first third, we're going to introduce you to Adobe Illustrator. The second third will be Photoshop, and the third third will be Adobe InDesign. I do quickly want to mention, I asked you all in the homework last week about your experience with these three programs. I just wanted to get a feel for where all of you were. For those of you who said that you have little to no experience in one, two, or three of these programs, please don't worry. That is my assumption. That is what I am basing the lessons off of. I'm assuming that you know nothing about them and we're starting from the ground up. For those of you that do have experience with these programs, hopefully along the way I'll be able to show you something new. Maybe you'll learn a new keyboard shortcut or a new technique or something. If not, at a minimum, you'll be able to spend some more time practicing these programs. And really, if you kind of are an expert in the program already, then consider this just a really easy semester in your college career. All right, so let's talk about Adobe Illustrator. And actually, the first thing I want to talk about is what is the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. Those are the two big design programs that Adobe has. They and Acrobat are what keeps the lights on at Adobe. And so, what is the difference between these two programs? Where should you use one versus the other? And at a really core level, there's a very, very simple difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. And that difference is that Illustrator is a vector graphics tool and Photoshop is a raster graphics tool. So, what do I mean by raster versus vector? So, these are basically the two ways that computers create illustrations or photos or images. Vector graphics rely on mathematical algorithms between defined points. Raster graphics rely on coloring in individual pixels. So let me give you a demonstration here to explain what I mean by that. So I have this Illustrator image here and of these two fish, and I'm just going to zoom in here on the eyeball of the fish. And you'll notice that as I zoom in, my curves on my eyeball are remaining nice and sharp. And so here I've zoomed into 12,000%, and I still have a very nice curve on this eyeball, and it's not just unique to the eyeball. We can see if I sort of move around here, all of my curves are still very, very crisp and smooth. And that is, again, because as a vector graphic, this circle here, zoomed in a little bit too far there. Okay, this circle here is actually defined. Oops, that was a problem selecting it. Hang on a second. Let me get in there and get this selected. That's still too much. There we go. Okay, so this circle is defined by these 4 points around the edge. And essentially what we've done is we said, okay, hey computer, there's a point here and there's a point here. And I want you to draw a curve between those 2 points. And then there's a point here and draw a curve between those 2 points. By the way, the vast majority of what we do in the next several weeks working with Illustrator will be detailing how we go about creating those points and defining them. But because this is a vector graphic, if I take this circle and I just make it roughly twice as big as it was, all I've done is tell the computer, hey, before this point and this point were a certain amount of distance from each other. Now this point is twice as far away from this point as it was, but the computer is simply going to recalculate that curve and keep that nice smooth curve between these 2 points. Let's contrast that with a raster graphic. So this is a Photoshop of my kids in front of a hobbit hole. And what I want to do here is the same thing that I did on that Illustrator graphic. I want to zoom in, and I'm just going to zoom in on my daughter's shoulder here. And Photoshop, which we'll get to in a few weeks, actually maxes out its zoom at 12,000%. So that's the maximum zoom that we can do in Photoshop. Illustrator actually goes further, all the way out to 64,000%. But we'll notice that while we were at 12,000% in Illustrator, my curves were still nice and smooth and still look like curves. Here at 12,000% in Photoshop, all I have is a bunch of colored boxes. And that's because this is how we create raster graphics. Basically, your computer screen is a great big sheet of graph paper. And each little square is what's called a pixel, which is a word that is actually short for picture element. And a pixel is a little square that makes up the image. And when we create raster graphics, rather than defining points and using algorithms to draw lines or curves between those points, we're actually going in and we're coloring in each of those little squares. The reason the image pixelates and becomes blocky like this is, as I've zoomed in here, each of those little squares is now 12,000 times bigger than it was. So whereas this square here used to be so small you couldn't even distinguish it, now it's this big, and so I can clearly see the square. If I start to zoom back out, we will see there's a point where those squares get small enough that our eyes start to get fooled into seeing curves again. And now I'm back to seeing, instead of a bunch of squares, I'm back to seeing a shoulder. And fairly quickly you can see those squares are small enough. This is 100%. So those squares are small enough now that our eyes are being fooled into seeing curves and shadows and different colors. And it starts to look again like a photograph rather than a bunch of squares. So in a nutshell, that's the difference between vector and raster. Vector graphics are what are called resolution independent graphics. That means that we can freely scale them and zoom in on them and do all of those things without impacting their quality. Raster graphics are vector dependent. Sorry, not vector dependent, that'd be silly. They are resolution dependent. As we zoom in or scale a raster graphic, we will lose quality because those squares just can only get so big before we can start seeing them. So again, in a nutshell, that is the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. Illustrator is a vector tool used for creating illustrations in vector formats. Photoshop is a raster tool used primarily for editing images that are already rasters. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, please don't hesitate to ask questions about that in Slack, and I will be happy to offer some clarification and help you out with that. So please proceed on to the next video where I'm going to actually introduce Illustrator and talk about the interface and the tools and all of those types of things.